to load everyone into the session and we'll get started momentarily. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you're all doing well. This is our 18th webinar in the 3 months since restrictions on meeting went into place in March. And since then, we've been joined by a global community interested in trade with over 5,000 participants on Zoom over these 18 sessions from over 75 different countries and 36 US states. We plan to continue holding weekly webinars in July and plan to continue hosting live online sessions in the fall, even when we're able to return to a sense of normal and back to live in-person events. Next week, we have a very special event celebrating the entry into force of the USMCA, the new NAFTA. For the hundreds of people who worked on the negotiation and consideration of the agreement across 3 countries, this is a day to celebrate. So WITA is going to hold an Implementation Day happy hour on Wednesday, July 1st at 4:30 p.m. Come see your friends in the trade community, and this time you'll be on camera to join in a discussion with and have some virtual fun with your friends in the WITA community. To give you a sense of who we're in the session today with, even if you can't see each other's faces, we'd like to mention a few of those who are with you on the session. So welcome today to today's webinar to Jordan Stone with the Association of American Railroads, Takeshi Komodo with the Embassy of Japan, Abby Gray with the Maine International Trade Center, and Jess Danker with the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Welcome, Jordan, Takeshi, Abby, and Jess, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, after discussion among our panelists, you'll have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box on your screen. Please try to use that, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Today, I'm pleased to welcome back to WITA, Rich Thau and his team. Rich is with Engagius and gave us a fascinating presentation at the Washington International Trade Conference in early February, in a time when we could safely meet in person, about Americans' attitudes towards trade. Like WITA, Rich's work is pivoted to the impact of COVID-19 on society, and several of us have seen this presentation, and it offers a fascinating insight into the views of average Americans about reopening, which has major implications for workers, firms, and trade. Today, Rich will be joined by his colleagues Gina Derrickson, Research Director at Engagius. Earlier in her career, Gina was a research director at Ipsos, and before that, a Senior Marketing Research Manager at Procter & Gamble. She will be also joined by John Lass, President of Sport and Leisure Research Group, which conducts public opinion research on sports, travel, and leisure, which is why I have my Zoom background on my favorite vacation spot, where I hope to get back to and hope to get some guidance from our guest today about when maybe that people think that'll be safe to do so. And then Ron Bonjean, a partner at ROK Solutions, who many of you may know from his time as Chief of Staff in the Senate Republican Caucus, Communications Director for the House Speaker, Press Secretary to Majority Leader Lott, and Director of Public Affairs at the Commerce Department. As mentioned, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button to submit them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before time runs out. With that, I'll turn it over to Ron.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate it, and it's great to be here. As we explore the insights from Wave 6, one thing is clear: there is much more uncertainty ahead. That's why we titled it, "I'm Getting By, but Everything's a Mess." What we have observed so far is an initial shock to the system with COVID-19, the economic shutdown, a back to normal trend, the trend interruption from social unrest, and a resurgence of coronavirus that might indicate a second spike. What is yet to be observed is additional divisiveness, potentially more conflicting information, an unprecedented election cycle, and one way or another, a new direction for the country. All of these will have reverberating effects for multiple areas, including the consumer, the sectors we track, including travel, leisure, medical, retail, media, entertainment, and of course, sports, health concerns, economic stability, safety, concerns regarding returning to work, public policy, and the reactions of local, state, and federal officials, and of course, changing the future of social interactions. The key takeaway of our research on a global level is that in the short to immediate term, there will be more developments that will have massive impacts on business. With that in mind, let's dig into the data. This screen helps us level set, and it's the number of people who have participated in the following activities in the past year. You can see on the left, 70% have visited a retail store. Down in the middle, 48% attending a live sports event, visiting a casino at 38%, all the way down to 13% attending an open house, or 12% touring a home listed for sale. With that, I'll turn it over to Rich Tao.
Thanks, Ron. It's great to be with all of you today. What I want to share, in addition to what Ron said about what people have done in the last year, is what they've also done in the past month. And what you see is that you've got 56% of people who have ventured out to a retail store, 29% have eaten at a restaurant, and then much more declining percentages of people going from visiting a dentist's office all the way down to seeing a movie in a theater at 4%. So there are some basic things that people are doing, and there are a number of things that they have yet to do. And that's just, again, to give you a sense of the nature of the people, the American consumers who are in this study. And what we want to do also is share with you something that we call our matrix of concerns. What we do is we ask about 3 different concerns, medical ones related to COVID-19, monetary ones related to personal finances and the state of the economy, and then the third column that we added after wave 4 having to do with social unrest. And what you see are a couple different dynamics. The first is that under the personal concerns, potential to contract the illness, their personal finances impact on that the unrest would have on their leisure activities, that you've got just over 1/3 who say that they are extremely concerned about those things. And when you look at the bottom row, the societal views of those particular issues, the level of extreme concern is much higher. It's basically roughly at a majority. And so as you think about where the next several slides that we take you through, think about the dynamic of having people more concerned about societal concerns broadly than they do about their own personal relationship to these issues. The other thing I want to just flag for you is that -10 number you see next to each item in the top row is the drop from wave 5 to wave 6. So we saw a pronounced drop in the level of extreme concern about those 3 things over the last half month. We field this study every 2 weeks. So the work that you see here was fielded June 17th, the prior work done June 3rd. So you see some generally positive trends in the fact that the extreme concern levels have dropped among the personal items. But there's a lot of material that you also need to see. Obviously, you've seen and heard the stories about the number of new cases rising in the U.S. What we found also in the study, as I mentioned before, is that you got 48% of the respondents who are extremely concerned, very concerned, about the recent social unrest in American society at large, and another 23% who are somewhat concerned. So that's important. But the question is, why are those who are very concerned very concerned? Well, we asked them, which of the following is your greatest concern about the recent social unrest? And what you see, if you look at the 2 bottom slices of this pie, bottom left, bottom right, that on the left, 24% said that their greatest concern was the lack of mask wearing during the protests and how it may increase the spread of COVID-19. On the right, it's the lack of social distancing during the protest that might increase the spread of COVID-19. So basically, you've got half the people, when it comes to the social unrest, not concerned necessarily as much about the cause of the social unrest as the consequences health-wise, which we thought was particularly noteworthy. Another thing to keep in mind is that we have a majority of people saying to us that they're following the rules. We asked this in wave 3 in early May. We asked it again in wave 6. The statement is, I've strictly followed stay-at-home and social distancing guidelines in place in my area. These are the percentages on the left of people who strongly agree with that statement. You got a majority, even though it's dropped, of people who say they strongly agree that they've been doing it. But look on the right. When it comes to the people around them in their area, it's now down to 31% that they think are also doing the things that they're doing. So that's a big gap, and I think it's indicative of people's concern that while they themselves might be following the guidelines, other people are not, and they're putting them at risk. As a result, every wave we do something called the confidence barometer, which is a singular score made up of 26 different component statements, trying to tell what percentage of the population feels like things are going well right now. And it's just at 27%. Here's the issue. When we started doing this project nearly 3 months ago, in wave 1, the score was 27%. It rose to 34% and then has ebbed back down to 27. The wave 5 results had the future expectations, that bottom right pie, at 40%. It has dropped 9 points between wave 5 and wave 6, which is obviously a pronounced drop. The current conditions one on the top left was already low and slipped a tiny bit further between wave 5 and wave 6. But we're particularly curious, why did the future expectations slip so much? Here's what happened. Looking at some of the component statements, 7 of them were at all-time lows. 4 of them had to do with societal future expectations. So look at the 4 statements on the right. Before the end of 2020, the unemployment rate will hit the high point and then decline as the economy begins to add jobs. I'm optimistic about the future of the economy. People will go back to spending freely on luxuries again in 2020. And the country will return to economic growth before the end of the calendar year. All 4 of those are at lows since we started the barometer. Then there's the personal future expectations. 3 of these are at lows. The best years of my life are still to come. I'm confident that I will have enough money to retire in comfort, and taking a vacation of over 500 miles is a priority for me and my family in the next 12 months. All of those personal future expectation statements are at lows for the barometer. So it's not a surprise when we ask people to evaluate the statement, it's time for the country to open for business again. And we see that 28% strongly disagree with that statement. And then the groups that over-index, that are higher than 28%, the subsegments, women at 33%, seniors at 30%, people politically liberal, 41%, people in the South and the West, where we're seeing flare-ups now, 31 and 33% respectively, and people with some college education, 39%. So again, we looked at all these, a variety of subsegments. These are the ones that over-index. So I'm going to transition now and have John Last tell you about what this means for specific sectors. He's going to use one sector as an example.
Thanks so much, Rich and Ken, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. One of the other components of the barometer that we spend a good amount of time looking at is clustering or segmenting respondents based on their relative readiness to re-engage in a variety of different activities. The study actually examines 14 different vertical activities. Here we're looking at people's willingness to attend a conference or a convention. And we ask them in each particular wave a series of questions that classify them into one of these categories, whether they were recently active, ready to go, which means that they are willing to re-engage in these activities without any further assurances or affirmations, whether they would be what we call assurance seekers. Those are folks who would be willing to resume as long as they had a combination, and it can be any combination, of assurances from national or local authorities, be they medical authorities or government authorities. And then the next biggest category next to ready to go in each of these is those that we call needing a breakthrough. These are people who say that they're not going anywhere until there is either an approved COVID-19 vaccine or a proven medical protocol to mitigate the effects of the virus. And as you may have seen in what Rich just showed you, we had seen kind of a linear growth in those who were ready to go as we moved from early April into mid-May. Over the last couple of waves, we've seen a little bit of stagnation. And then in this most recent wave, we've actually seen kind of a counterclockwise shift, if you will, of people's state of readiness. So the ready to goes have gone down, and those who need a medical breakthrough have actually increased to the point here that from a trade show and convention standpoint, they're basically at statistical parity, just as many people ready to go as those who need a breakthrough. So we've been optimistic to see up until this point the ready to go segment get higher. It's still the largest of all the segments, but clearly there's a dichotomous situation going on where you have just as many folks who are really entrenching, and that has become even more amplified in the most recent wave of research. We move to the next slide, we can see that the next thing we wanted to look at was for those who were not ready to go, once they had the necessary assurances that it was safe to resume activities, how quickly are they going to go back? And again, looking at conferences and conventions as one example, again, we have many categories and verticals that we look at here. The good news is that once they do get to that state of assurance, they are coming back fairly quickly. Nearly 7 in 10 will be back in 3 months. You can see that even within a 2-month period, you have over a majority of those in the survey who are not ready to go back right now would come back within a 2 months period of time. And this is one sector or one metric that we've looked at that actually has improved and continues to. It did not necessarily go downward in this most recent wave with a lot of other hesitancy that was being shown. So the good news is that once people do get a certain level of comfort, there is certainly a pent-up anticipation and willingness to get back into the activities. It just seems that now we're seeing a little bit of a blip in terms of people feeling that that is going to be in the short term. We also asked, we wanted to get a sense, you say you're ready to go, more things here have obviously begun to open up. What's the likelihood that they actually will do so? And the interesting phenomenon here, of course, is that as you look across this, we're only looking at about 40 to 60%, roughly half, who feel that, pragmatically speaking, once they are able to do these activities, will they really re-engage within the next 2 months? And it really doesn't vary much across a number of these different activities. You can see once they can go to a sports, those who are ready to go to a sports event, only 58% feel they actually will do so within the next 2 months. Similarly, visiting a retail store, those only 54% feel they actually will within the 2 month period. And obviously it begets the question of why. And the answer is actually quite different depending upon what sector you look at. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that in the standpoint of, again, conventions and conferences, it's health concerns that are most holding these people back. So they have a readiness to go in their mindset, but they're not sure that health concerns are going to allow them to go back. And I think it's important to look hierarchically at some of the other elements that they're evaluating. There's the case of prioritization. In this particular instance, 50% aren't going back because they have other priorities. It's less in this case about social unrest or economic concerns or the accessibility of these particular activities. And I will note that if you looked at this and if we replicated this slide for this presentation across a number of the other verticals, you'd see a very different pattern in terms of what's holding people back. For sporting events, the number one inhibitor is people just obviously not believing that spectators will be allowed into sporting events within the next 2 months. When you look at it from the standpoint of things like retail, it's more about priorities. So very interesting to note that the scenarios and the inhibitors are quite variable based on what activity you're looking to resume. So moving a little further into this hesitation, Gina is going to talk to you now about some of the in-depth interviews that are a regular part of the barometer. The barometer actually includes 4 different methodologies that we conduct throughout each wave of the research. Gina actually took some time to speak with people in our most recent wave who had actually begun to venture out into the marketplace, but still had some hesitancy to do so across a large number of verticals. And she has some insights right now about what's pushing them back.
Thanks, John. And hi, everyone. So there you see some of the faces of people that I spoke to, and we actually talked to them last week. So it's been about a week now. So we talked to them about their hesitations about some activities and their recent experiences. So really what comes to the top is with no clear directions, they're guessing or making their own assumptions about what's safe for them and what they should do. Many of them speak about fears of a second wave or an increase in COVID-19. They don't necessarily trust the numbers that they're hearing, or they've tired of following them. So they use the information that they've learned to trust over time, kind of combine that with a gut or some intuition, and they come up with a level of assessment on their own that works for them. I want to share a few quotes that came out in our interviews just to help you kind of see where people's minds are. This is from a woman that talks about she is in an area where neighboring states are showing an increase in numbers. And she says, so I try to ignore it as best as I can so I don't freak myself out. So she's kind of using a coping mechanism of ignoring just to live on daily. And next is someone that lives in a state where she felt her governor was pressured to open up the economy quicker than he should have. So she says it's happening way too fast. I think we're going to regret a lot of these decisions in a couple of months. So you see, even though these people may be starting to get out and do things, there's still some fear and some anxiety building in their minds. Next, we talked about shopping. It requires thought for them. It's not like being on autopilot like shopping used to be. It's almost like trying to do a task that you do all the time, but now you're blindfolded and you have to think about all of the steps and everything that you need to do. So some things that they shared with me, there's a lot of general anxiety and tension, stress. People are exhausted. Nobody really fully knows what to do out in retail stores. Somebody shared an experience where he went shoe shopping and he tried on some shoes, and the ones that he wasn't purchasing, he put back in the box and back on the rack. And after reflecting back on it, he said, I don't know if that was the right thing to do or not, but that's what I did. So kind of that's how we ended up. Someone else talked about going to a craft store, and she said, I just had to assume when I walked in, the carts by the entrance had been cleaned and the carts by the exit were dirty, but there was no sign to indicate that. There were no cleaning wipes or spray around, so she couldn't do a double cleaning to make sure. So she kind of assumed a small risk when she went in the store by grabbing a cart at the entrance, but wasn't actually sure. So lastly, unaware of the right boundaries, people are creating their own, and we're hearing people doing things like choosing outdoor dining versus inside at a restaurant. It's convenient that we're in June, and for many people, the nice weather can accommodate that. They're also, instead of traveling what would be a traditional type of vacation for themselves, they're looking for local places to escape. We hear about road trips, doing things where they're staying in state, and doing things like camping or renting a cabin. And the cabin idea is for those people who have kind of been isolating at home. They see renting a cabin is, I'm going to pick up and move my stuff to the cabin. We're just going to isolate together at the cabin. So it's almost like what we've been doing for the past few months, but it's a change of scenery that they need. Then finally, I want to talk about mask wearing. Kind of a second benefit that came up from people who wear masks is they say they find that other people who may not be in masks will tend to give them more space in stores and out and about. So they're getting that assured social distancing because they're in a mask, and people assume that they're either overcautious about it or maybe they have a medical condition and that's why they're wearing the mask. So next, we talked about testing, and is it really the key to returning? People have heard that testing, it's good that we're building capabilities for testing. It's all about testing. So people are telling me that they think that more testing is good, but they continue to be concerned about reliability, and they're not so sure about the benefits. So some of the questions that they're asking is, who should have a test? When should you have it? Do you need to be showing symptoms? How often should you have it? Is it really for everybody? They also ask, can you catch COVID-19 again? And there seems to be different thoughts about this, but that really kind of leads to the helpfulness of the serum antibody testing. If you can catch COVID-19 again, then maybe that test isn't so beneficial either. Someone summed it up as saying, given the newness of everything, it probably provides a false sense of security when somebody either tests negative for COVID-19 or tests positive for the antibodies. So it's kind of like a get out of jail free card that maybe wasn't earned properly. It sets up for risk in the future. So finally, the real benefit, most people come to the conclusion that testing is necessary for vaccine development, but I have yet to find someone that can clearly articulate kind of how it's necessary or what that path is. And back to John to talk about our next topic.
Thanks, Gina. So obviously one of the other things that's really emerged as we've gone through subsequent waves of the barometer is to look at its impact on commerce. And one of the aspects that we've been looking at that really kind of reared its head most recently is the propensity to litigate against vendors and the liability concerns that very well may be looming in wake of the pandemic. So I want to talk a little bit about what we saw. And in this first slide, we actually asked people to imagine that they'd return to some of their favorite activities and had assurances from that property or provider that the guidelines were being followed for a safe and sanitary environment. And 1 week later, they found out someone who was present at the same time that they were had come down with COVID-19. And then a few days later, you came down with the illness. And we asked people about their propensity on a scale from 1 to 10 to potentially pursue legal action against the property or provider. Now, this doesn't mean they're actually going to sue them, but this is their level of interest. These are the folks, the percentage of people who on a 10-point scale said 8, 9, or 10, they would be very interested, very likely to think about it. And you can see that across every one of these activities that we've listed here, there's a pretty substantial percentage of folks that would do this, particularly males versus females. 55% felt that they would do so if they attended an open house and this situation occurred, 44% if they took a commercial flight, 50% if they attended a conference or a convention. So a fairly substantial percentage, and it's the men who, more so than the women, tend to be most litigious, or at least in terms of consideration thereof. Let's take a look at another scenario. We kind of took the same situation, and now we added the dynamic that everybody actually signed a release, a hold harmless release, before they actually engaged in the activity, and the same thing happened. And you can see that while the percentages have dropped somewhat, there's still a substantial minority of folks across each of these different activities who say that they would pursue legal action. And again, the males certainly dwarf the females in terms of their likelihood to engage in legal activity. So let me go on to some other things. From a workplace standpoint, we are also looking at, where do people sit in terms of what employees want and expect, and what will the future of the workplace look like? Let's explore a couple things that we've looked at. One of which is the whole work from home phenomenon. And interestingly, this corroborates some individual custom work that we've done within individual organizations. And that is that a substantial percentage of employees, and these are the employees that are represented in this particular slide, strongly agree that once the economy reopens, they would be open to continue working from home at least as much as they are now. Only 18%, less than 1 in 5, strongly disagree. So as we've certainly seen these types of Zoom presentations become more prevalent, the average employee certainly is recognizing, and we have other questions that have supported this, that they've found that their levels of productivity can be very much less than compromised from working from home, and they've become very accustomed and comfortable with that particular situation. They're also sensitive about going back to work. We asked the question, if my employer makes us use web-based video conferencing while in the office, I will question, why are we working from the office in the first place? And as you see, 44% strongly agreed with this particular statement. Another that we asked, if people can remove a mask in their personal offices and people in common areas cannot, that is a form of discrimination. And you see that nearly a third strongly agreed with that particular statement. So clearly the return to the workplace may not be as smooth or as welcomed as we may hope it to be. We also took a look at the same phenomenon that I just showed you from a commerce standpoint about employees' willingness to sue their employers. And we asked a scenario very similar to the one that I just spoke to you about from a commerce side. In this case, they're coming back to work on the 1st of the month, and on the 7th, they find out that someone got COVID-19 and then they came down with it. How likely would they be to pursue legal action against their employers? And you can see it's still a little bit lower than what we saw from a vendor standpoint, but you still have more than a third of the overall sample saying that they would pursue legal action. You're still seeing 44% of the males that would do so. And again, going across this slide are a number of other segments that jumped out as those who would out-index the overall percentage. So 40% of those in that ready-to-go segment that we talked about, 40% of those under the age of 35, 42% of those who identify ideologically as liberal, and 50% of those in the Northeast census region. So a real likelihood to do so from this standpoint. And moving on to the next slide, we'll see that again within that same scenario, again, let's assume that the employer had followed every protocol for face masks, for social distancing, for testing of employees. They still, you don't see these numbers drop down all that significantly. Still over a quarter, a pretty substantial segment of employees who would potentially pursue legal action. And again, some of the same specific subsegments that over-index in terms of their propensity to look into legal action. Now, that said, if we move to the next slide, here's the situation of, actually, we talked on the previous slide also about signing a release. It still wouldn't impact their ability to do so. So in this particular instance, they actually had signed a release and had done so. I'm going to turn it back to Gina now, who is going to give you a little bit of positive spin on what I just reported. That said, despite the fact that they are interested in pursuing legal action, the qualitative kind of raises some questions as to how likely they really will be to actually follow through with that thought. Gina?
So we actually talked about this in wave 4. So if you're observant, you notice that the faces changed. That's because we talked to 10 different people with each wave of research. But what they said about this is they're realistic about the situation with employment and legal action. They are they speak highly of how their employer has handled the pandemic so far, saying that their employers have helped them set up remote offices. They've offered flexibility in work schedules. Some of them even sent hand sanitizer to their homes. So they're pretty pleased with how that has been handled so far. And they would be hesitant to sue the employer unless the employer proves to be lackadaisical about the whole precautions and protecting their employees. So that's kind of the tipping point. If a company demonstrates that they're more focused on profit than on protecting their employees, it changes the story. Employees know that they must assume some level of risk returning to work, just as they assume risk returning to other activities. And they also recognize that it would be difficult to trace an illness with a specific exposure in the workplace. So what should companies do to avoid legal conflicts? Some of the ideas that they came up with were stating the rules for returning and making sure that you follow and enforce them consistently. We had talked in previous rounds about the importance of being clear about rules. When you think about things like requiring masks being worn at a desk and how can people, drink coffee and eat snacks at their desk. This is one example of where it's important to be crystal clear on expectations and make sure they're being enforced consistently. It's simply not enough to have precautions in a policy, but companies must ensure they're being followed. They also say you should take care of people who become sick with COVID-19. Check in on them, show them that you care. They suggested that it would be important to hold a reorientation for employees to review policy changes to ensure expectations are clear for everyone. They suggest that coming back to the workforce after being off for COVID and with all the changes in the workplace, it would almost be like we're new employees and we need to know, kind of how do things work now. And lastly, they suggested signing an agreement that all employees signed that suggested that employees will follow the rules and not hold the company liable. And that's important just because they want to make sure all coworkers are being held responsible and accountable for their actions. And Rich is going to take us to an example that brings us to life even more.
Thanks, Gina. And this is the last segment of the presentation. So one thing that we did in May is we conducted what you would call an online dial test where we got moment-to-moment feedback on a short video. In this video, a boss anticipates her staff's return to the office. So let me give you the context. Separate from the barometer and the large sample we looked at, we also did a smaller project where we looked at 36 working from home Americans, and they watched a 2-minute video embedded in an online survey. They were told the following: you're going to see a video that could be from the president of any small or mid-sized business in America that operates out of an office, but where the employees currently are working from home. I'd like you to imagine, for the sake of this exercise, the person in the video is your boss and has made this video to send to all employees. So what they did was they watched a video of this woman playing the role of the boss, and then they moved this red dot back and forth between 0 and 100. 0 is in real time, they strongly disliked what she was saying, and 100, they strongly liked what she was saying. We took a reading from every respondent every second. And what you're going to see now is the video. And when you watch it, you'll see 3 lines migrating across the screen representing 3 different age groups. I want you to focus in particular on the people 55 and older, the purple line, and notice how their responses differ from those in the 2 younger age groups. And again, if the line moves up, they strongly like what she's saying. If it drops, it means they strongly dislike it. That would be 100 and 0.
Good news. Local authorities have given us the all clear to open our offices on June 18th. On that date, we expect our staff to report to work in their assigned office location. We continue to prioritize the safety of our staff and have thoroughly planned our return to in-person operations. We will follow CDC guidelines with precautions that include providing masks, hand sanitizer, and disinfecting wipes throughout the office, screening employees and visitors for fevers, maintaining social distancing, and increasing the frequency of professional cleaning within the building. We are all in this together. And I'd like to offer some additional thoughts. We are dedicated to providing a clean office, but it is impossible to ensure a 100% virus-free environment where people gather for an entire day. We are requiring each and every employee to take ownership of their safety and health by wearing recommended PPE, washing their hands thoroughly, and staying 6 feet apart. These measures decrease your chances of catching COVID-19. Any employee who doesn't feel well with potential symptoms of COVID-19 should get tested and work from home until they feel better. Lastly, if one of our colleagues were to come down with COVID-19, we will notify everyone in our organization. That said, there are many different places where someone can be exposed to the virus, so it would be difficult to confirm it originated in our workplace. It is in our business's best interest to go back to normal activities as soon as we can. That includes operating out of our office. We look forward to seeing you on June 15th. Please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.
So clearly the younger group responded far more favorably than the negative group did, the older group did. And I want to show you some comments that explain that. So after they saw the video, we asked people to respond by typing some comments in. And this is what we heard from one of the older women. It was the company's expectations for everyone to return to the workspace regardless of how people felt. There was no choices. There was no options to work from home if the people can be productive. There was no special cases for people who have health issues. And in all caps, an older gentleman wrote, the company doesn't seem to really care about employees and is just covering their asses. Meanwhile, the people under 35 really embraced it. I think the video is very encouraging by helping people be hopeful about the coronavirus. Another woman said they can allow people to work from home if they have symptoms. And a younger gentleman said she wants to make sure everyone is safe and understands what to do when going back to work. So as you can see, the exact same message was received very differently depending upon some of these respondents' ages. So with that, we'll be happy to open it up for questions. I know, Ken, you'll be moderating that, and we're happy to take those.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, John, Gina, and Ron. I really appreciated it. We've had a couple comments, people asking about your deck. Is that something, is there a version of that that you think you'd be able to share with us that we can distribute to our attendees? Is that something we can do?
Absolutely, we'd be happy to.
Great, thanks. So I know that we've had actually 3 questions on that front, and it's fantastic data. I know we all want to keep going back to it. I myself kept wanting to hit pause at different points just so I could keep looking at that data. And I've seen the presentation or an earlier version of it, so thank you for that. One person asked a question, just if you could expand a little bit about who you were surveying, what was the database of people that were surveyed? I'm not talking about the focus group. I'm talking about the polling you did, how many people, et cetera.
Sure. So, we do this every other week, and we work with a nationally representative sample of Americans. So this is to replicate the population. We put in very rigorous quotas based on regionality and gender and income distribution. And we gather these people from a variety of different sources of panels that exist to support research work like this. And actually, unlike a lot of other research, we don't rely solely on one. We actually take kind of and blend the best breed of respondents from a variety of different sources. We find that to be a more effective and representative way than to just go to a single source.
Thank you. And I want to remind, sorry, go ahead, Rich, please.
Okay, I'll just also add, so the national sample is generally about 600, and there are people who are involved in sports or leisure activities. And in the last few waves, when we started getting into all the liability questions, we wanted to make sure we also had a sample of voters. So there's an overlay of additional respondents. And so the total sample of voters tends to be about 750 or so, but then the smaller subsegment of people who are sports fans. It gets a little complicated in terms of what the base is. It depends on which questions we're analyzing.
Thank you, thanks. And a reminder, please use the Q&A button to ask questions, and we'll try to pass along as many of those as we can. I was wondering, what are you hearing from employers? What are their feelings? I don't know if you've had a chance, you've surveyed kind of the people who are workers and people going to these events. Have you had a chance, even in some of your focus groups or others, to talk about the other side of the equation, what you're hearing from them about their thoughts on reopening? And I apologies if that's not something you've done. I'm just curious.
It's not been part of the specific project. What I can tell you is that the Barometer is being sponsored by a sizable number of major trade associations. So the tiny bit of the backstory is that in Wave 4, we looked at the employer-employee relationship, and I think a number of the association executives were somewhat startled by what we found. And a couple of them said to us, okay, that's fine. What about the vendor-client relationship and the propensity of people to sue their vendors? So we went in Wave 5 and looked at that dynamic and came back, as you just saw, with fairly similar numbers. So it's definitely on people's radar. I think that the sense that we get is that people are relieved that this is not the percentage of people who will sue. It's the percentage of people who have a propensity to do it. And I kind of been joking that in my next life, I want to come back as a trial attorney after a pandemic. But from a practical standpoint, as Gina, I think so eloquently explained, when she actually interviewed people, they were not rushing to sue their employers. Most people recognize that if an employer makes a good faith effort to do the right thing, that employer is going to be fairly protected. It's the ones who are lackadaisical who are in the most danger.
This is a question I asked you on a previous session, and it keeps coming up, but what are the attitudes of people who are not obeying sort of common sense social distancing protocols or safety protocols, wearing a mask, keeping distance? What are their attitudes? Have you been able to hone in a little bit on what their thinking is about why they feel like they don't need to do that?
So we've looked more at who they are, I think, than what the specific attitude is.
Okay.
It's an interesting question, Ken. I mean, I could tell you that we know that the early ready-to-go people, the ones who are ready to rush out, and even in the depths of the early stages of the pandemic, they tended to be younger, they tended to be male, and they tended to be on the ideological extremes, very liberal or very conservative, which does sort of suggest that there's sort of a libertarian streak, both left-focused and right-focused, that drives folks to be willing to do these things and to engage in all these activities and not terribly worry about the health impacts. So, but there's been obviously a massive amount of media coverage of these people, interviewing them. I was watching cable news last night and asking people, like, well, this doesn't matter to me. I don't care. I don't think it's going to affect me. So we've heard people say those kinds of things. But we've been obviously looking at it from the focus point of what it's going to take to re-engage people who are not engaged, more so than the people who are like, hey, I'm already out there, and have been out there all along, and the pandemic is kind of like an afterthought.
So let me flip the question around a little bit, and this playing off one of the questions that came in that I was having a little trouble sorting out, but have you been able to hone in at all on the attitudes of people who have gone back to work, maybe are in a position where they're sort of somewhat required to go back to work, whether they're healthcare workers or service workers who have been working, and their attitudes about how other people treat social distancing and safety issues?
I think one interesting dynamic behind that was there were a number of people who wanted to go back, but recognized that and were empathetic towards the fact that there were a number of people who that wouldn't be right for. And I think one of the things that struck me, and this was, I think, a wave or two ago, was that there seemed to be more of a willingness to embrace that flexibility, that hybrid type work experience. So I think that's one of the more poignant things that we've learned about in that regard. I don't know if that really answers that.
So another question that came in is, and maybe this is bringing back a slide, but you showed a slide, I'm going to read it to you. You showed a slide about the percentage of people who strongly disagreed with the assertion that we should open up the economy. What was the percentage of those who strongly agreed with the statement that we should open the economy?
Here's what we'll do, Ken.
Yeah.
John Last, as the master of the crosstabs, will dive into the hundreds of pages and find the answer to that question if you give us another question to answer in the meantime.
Oh.
He's going to need about 2 minutes to find it.
Okay, I'm going to ask my own question. And we encourage folks, if they do have questions, to please submit them. But you've managed to, you've been doing this for a couple of months now. And you've already started baking into your recent data how people are responding to all the people they saw on the streets during the recent protests. Some with masks, some without, but obviously a lot of people close together, and that's something you've reflected in your new data, and you've shown that there's been some changes. We're also now seeing, it appears to be a broad nationwide spike again in cases across parts of the country that maybe weren't seeing the worst of it in April and early May. What is your instinct and gut on what you're going to see in the next round of surveying about reopening? I'm very worried. I've been worried for the past month myself that we're going to be right back where we were in April in about 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, I think it won't take until July to uncover that. I think we saw that in the June 17th data, the most recent wave that we just did, which was wave 6. And the fact of the matter is you had hesitancy in the South and the West about reopening. Not a surprise when you're having spikes in cases in the South and the West. They over-indexed about reopening the economy. And we didn't see data like that before. The hesitancy in the past was in the Northeast, when the cases were in the Northeast. So I think, yeah, it's like it suddenly becomes, well, now it's really affecting me, right? It's happening in my neighborhood. And I think that's going to take some of the numbers that we're always seeing downward trends on and probably exacerbate them. You know, obviously, when we started seeing things seeming to improve a bit in early and late May, particularly in later May, we saw a really great improvement in a number of these metrics. People started thinking, wow, you know, maybe we're past all of this. And now we're seeing that perhaps they're not, and the numbers are trending back down again. So I think public opinion seems to be moving very closely in line with the caseload. And it's just probably where the emphasis is shifting is based upon where those higher numbers are occurring. But overall, yeah, when there's a lot of cases and you're hearing about spikes, unsurprising that people are going to be less willing to venture out, less willing to go out, less willing to go back to the office. Yeah, all that I think is of a piece.
So another question that came in is, you know, notwithstanding, I'm combining two questions that came in. There have been a lot of studies recently that have said that if there was closer to universal mask wearing in public, we would be much more safely able to open the economy because we'd so significantly reduce the transmissions. Have you been able to survey at all how the federal government's sort of bifurcated response, where the health officials are saying wear masks, but some political leaders are not wearing masks, if that's having any impact on people?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at the sort of the on high commentary about mask wearing. What we've looked at, and we looked at mask wearing a lot, is the idea that in certain activities, mask wearing should be required, especially when people are compactly sitting alongside one another. And what we saw, and we see roughly about 2/3 think that in those situations, it should be required. But you still got a hard third who disagree with that, and maybe like a really dug in 1/5, 1/6, roughly, who are very much against that. And so you can easily see why some company looking at the question, should we require our customers to wear a mask, would look at the glass half full or 2/3 full and say, yeah, majority clearly want masks to be required. But then they look at the really hardcore minority, much smaller minority, and say, we're going to actively put off some 15 to 20 some odd percent segment of our customers if we make them do this. And I think that's where the hesitation comes in knowing that you're just going to really annoy or put off to the point where they won't engage some small but noticeable subsegment. It's not like it's 3% who refuse to wear a mask. There's a higher double-digit segment, low double-digit segment who feel that way. And I think that's the hard challenge. You know, it's easy for a majority, a close to majority, to strongly agree, yes, everyone should wear a mask. Someone sitting next to me in X, Y, or Z setting should absolutely be required to wear a mask, particularly if I'm required to wear one myself. I don't know if that fully answers the question. I think John might have an answer to your earlier question too.
I think John does. And so John, the question, if I'll repeat it, was you showed a slide about the percentage of people who strongly disagree with the assertion that we should get the economy back to business. What's the percentage of those who strongly agreed with the statement that we should open up the economy and get back to business?
So interestingly, in looking at this, and this is for the aggregate sample, the answer obviously varies by a number of the different segments and demographics. Just a third strongly agree with it's time to open the country up for business again. That's an 8, 9, or 10 on a 10-point scale. So a smaller percentage feel that way than feel that we're moving too quick.
Thanks. And to drill back one quick question, Rich, and it may not be one that you've polled yet, or maybe you can extract from the data. It comes from good friend of WITA, Ron Lorenzen. He's just asking a simple question in a sense. Who do people listen to? National government leaders, local leaders, public health experts, their own doctor, or are they listening to other people they know and trust?
We actually asked that question very specifically in an earlier wave. And interestingly, you know, again, this goes back a month or so, but the answer is more geared towards local authorities. There was, and Gina can back this up with some of what she heard in her qualitative, people recognize that the situation is vastly different in different parts of the country. So what fits for us may not fit for everybody else. And as one sitting here in New York, I find some irony that now, you know, as us being the petri dish about 3 months ago, now yesterday it was announced by the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut that we wanted to quarantine people coming from certain states into New York. So it's amazing how things change.
Yeah, and I asked recently, so governors come up sometimes. Some people trust their employer if they feel confident about how their employer has made decisions along the way. Some people, if they have a medical specialist, that's who they're relying on. One woman talked about her son had a condition, so they were looking at her son's endocrinologist because the son was kind of like, he had the most severe case. So if something was okay for the son, then it was okay for the rest of the family. And then a lot of people might have a friend or a relative in healthcare that can either speak to, you know, their specialty a little bit, or can say, you know, this is what's going on in the hospital, to where that local relevance comes in as well.
One thing I'd say, Ken, just as a very quick point, this is sort of a corollary to the Tip O'Neill, all politics is local line. All healthcare considerations are local. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're in Missoula, what's happening in Duluth. It's unimportant. It matters where you are, and from the travel perspective, where you're going. And what it looks like in the states that you're flying over or driving through are not important unless you're driving and you have to stop in the restroom.
As somebody who just was dropped off my daughter at summer camp that's open in Western Pennsylvania, following a lot of safety protocols, I know how just that stop at the rest area was one that we had to consider carefully. But sometimes nature calls. So one question that came up is that given and this comes from Irv Williamson, a noted trade person here in Washington, given the disparate impact of COVID-19 on different racial groups, did you see any differences in responses based on race? And I might add to that maybe about income level as well.
We do see some variation across a variety of different demographic category classifications, and we call them out where they are significant. Interestingly, you know, in kind of thinking back across each of these waves, we haven't seen really significant differences driven by race. We've seen it more driven by gender and age than looking at things, you know, other demographic factors.
The other thing, Ken, is that given the nature of the research we've done, some of those racial categorizations have samples that are fairly small in the data. And so when you get into subcategories of that, the numbers just are not large enough for us to feel that we're comfortable projecting them. So I just want to make that clear too.
So there was a question that came in from someone in the manufacturing sector, and they were asking, are you getting a perception of a difference between, and I apologize if I'm not asking the question exactly right, but the perception of people in different sectors of their own ability to either on the management side or worker side to go back? So are manufacturing employers and workers more likely than people maybe in service industries to be willing to go back? Or, because you surveyed people who are doing well from working from home, but a lot of jobs don't allow that. That's not, if you're working a restaurant, work from home doesn't do you much good. Telework, et cetera. So have you segmented a bit based on sector, how different sectors feel about it?
We haven't dove into that as deeply. Again, with some of the things that we've added to the survey and working with those organizations that are supporting the barometer, that has not come up as much in depth as perhaps it should. So it's something that we would be prepared to do, but we have not as of yet.
We have, there's some custom research that people have been asking us about possibly doing that would enable us to look at that in more detail. So if one of your attendees would want to talk to us about doing a deeper dive in specific sectors, we'd love to talk to them about doing that. We're very curious about it. It comes up from time to time, and we'd love to be able to have a better answer than the one we just gave you. Thank you.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the questions that came in, I think, goes right to the sweet spot. And that is, and you may have some data on this because I know it's been a priority as well, but have you looked at the impact COVID is having on the meetings and events sector? I know, John, obviously, it's come up. Conventions, I think, was one of the first categories you showed us, but have you done any deeper dives on that, or is that one of those areas where people might want to reach out for a bit more specific information?
We have a ton of data on that. So in every wave, I think, John, maybe except for one, maybe the first one, we asked about conventions and conferences. So, and just to be clear, there's an opportunity if someone wants to co-sponsor. We do not have a sponsor specifically in that sector. We have sponsors in a variety of sectors that you saw in some of those charts. But that is one that we actually sort of use as a catch-all to share with general audiences like yours. But we'd love to have a paid sponsor in that section too.
Absolutely. So I know the answer to this myself, but I'm just going to ask you it because it's a leading question to some extent, is do your questions shift wave to wave? And importantly, will the coming waves or coming research include questions related to the November elections and people's willingness to vote or the way they would want to vote?
All right, so the answer to the first part of the question is yes. There's a core group of questions that we ask in every single wave. In fact, John has been doing a barometer type research study going back in one form or another more than 20 years. So there's some questions that John has been asking forever, and that's part of the core of the project. Then there are new questions, obviously, we're asking specifically about re-engaging around the pandemic, so you've seen a lot of that. And then there's a whole bunch of new questions that we add in every new wave of research. So yes, we are shifting. So we did, for example, we did not start asking about social unrest until the wave 5 in early June. So yeah, so we're going to keep doing the things that are relevant as new things come up. In terms of the election, we have been really very careful in this study to stay away from the political questions, the active political questions. The closest we've really gotten has been to ask about mask wearing and looking at liberals versus conservatives, that type of thing, or to ask about some of the litigation stuff we talked about, which has some obviously policy ramifications. But I think in terms of who people are going to vote for and that kind of thing, I think we really want to make sure this is not politicized, because as soon as we come out and say X is going to do better than Y, then suddenly we lose half of the audience because they're upset that we told them that they're going to lose.
So the question, though, more was about willingness to vote, willingness to go to a polling place versus mailing in ballots, not about who they prefer.
Yeah, we probably should start doing that, and so the open question for us is, how long is this going to go on? Will the sponsors want to keep sponsoring this? Well, if things start to really improve, there's no need for a barometer, right? If people are back and doing what they were doing, back to normal barometer doesn't matter if things are back to normal. But if things are still in sort of this very fluid state, there's a lot of illness, the economy hasn't recovered, and people want us to keep doing this into October, I think as we get closer to the election, certainly that becomes a very important set of questions to ask, because it's a form of re-engagement. And I think we should probably get to that point.
So thank you all. I am going to answer one question that was put to me. No, that is not where I am located. I am not on the beach in Southern Florida. I put that up because that's where I want to be. It's a Zoom virtual background. I'm a big fan of those. Normally coming to you from a virtual living room that is very lovely, but not my own. It's just a virtual background. And this is Marathon, Florida, where I was on vacation back before COVID restrictions, and I would love to go back to. So thank you all for joining us. Really grateful. Rich, maybe as I'm just closing out, if you could pop up that screen with your email addresses, that would be helpful for folks. And then I will try to share those. We'll put those on our website as well, and we'll also link to your deck. Maybe we'll just leave that up there for just a second. I'll talk over it. Thank you all very, very much. We'll put your email addresses on our website with the deck that you shared so that folks can see, look at the data themselves at their leisure, and reach out to you guys directly for follow-up. I know that there were some definite sectoral interests that were there, and hopefully you can follow up directly with Rich and the team. Thank you, Rich, Ron, John, and Gina. We really appreciate your joining us today for this session. Really important stuff you guys are doing. And I hope you're right. I hope there isn't a wave we're examining in October, although I'm a little personally worried that there may be. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Take care, everyone. Be healthy, be safe. And we look forward to seeing you again at WITA at our next event next week, our USMCA happy hour, virtual happy hour. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks, Ken.